Hi everyone. Um, this coronavirus pandemic that's really changed everybody's lives so drastically and is impacting so many people worldwide has made me reflect a lot in recent days on my own family's experience with the pandemic 100 years ago, the Spanish flu. So I thought for my grandkids' sake, I really should share some stories and information about that pandemic 100 years ago in America and worldwide, and what people's lives were like then and how different things were, but how much the same a crisis like a virus with no vaccine can impact everyone. So this story that I have is it's one that was told many times in my family because my mother's mother, Mamie Martin, died in the Spanish flu epidemic in 1918. And she was a lovely woman. She was about 29. Mom was 2 at the time. And her littlest child, Juanita, was born 2 months before. So, and she was happily married, and they were in Montana, in Conrad, Montana, near my great-grandma's house, Nana Martin and Henry Martin. And that was, they had a big ranch. And so Mamie had given birth on the ranch, and my great-grandmother delivered the baby, Juanita. And so by the time the troops were coming back from World War I, they really, the spread of the virus came so quickly, and it killed people in the young adult age range then. It wasn't the little ones or the older ones. For some reason, it really hit the young working folks who had a lot of life to live. So I wanted to share some things about that time, and I'll show you a picture of this beautiful woman who passed at 29 and whose legacy really shaped a lot of my life. This is an old photo of Mamie Martin, my mom's mom, so she would be my grandmother that I never got to meet. And this was probably just before she got married, so at the time she might have been about 22, and when she died she was about 29 or 30. And just to make the story a little more personal, she went to college. She went to Hardin College in Missouri and graduated from that school, and she was a fine artist. And this is one of her little paintings that survived, probably did it in art school. So we always had this hanging in the house, and I have a couple other paintings of hers as well. So her legacy of being an artist always inspired me to learn how to do watercolor and paint and so forth. Now, the Spanish flu epidemic 100 years ago, many of you know this story, but my grandkids probably don't know as much. That epidemic started and got virulent because of World War I, and all the troops were starting to come back home, and they had been packed into these military hospitals in France, and then in America in it was Fort Riley, Kansas. And so there's a hospital in France and one in Kansas that they think might have been kind of the epicenter of the Spanish flu. Because from there, they all went, the ones who survived, got over their wounds, they all spread out on troop trains and went home. And the big ships that took them back from Europe and across the Atlantic, they were packed in together very tightly. Conditions were very unsanitary. There was very little room to move. And when the victory celebrations in America occurred in November 11th, Armistice Day, people still didn't understand how this flu could be something contagious in that sense of people breathing on each other and being packed tightly. So celebrations occurred all over the country when they came back, and big parades, New York City and all the big cities and hometowns, people all came together. So in November was when it really just exploded, and my grandmother died in late November. So it just swept through the country. One of the questions my cousin and I had was how could she have died, and they were out on a ranch. Now who knows, how much they went in and out of the town that was nearby, because they were near Butte, Montana. My grandpa was the superintendent of copper mines there, and Mamie's husband, Arthur, he worked for the railroads, which was a big industry at that time. But my thinking was that on the ranch, they were hiring a lot of ranch folk who were probably men coming back from war and helping with all the ranch duties. And at that time, people didn't live in motels or hotels or whatever. They probably housed them there on the farm, and they fed them, most likely. So Mamie could have easily come in contact with someone who had been returning from the war, and probably was a carrier or had gotten over it themselves. So anyway, that's the possibility. Now, at that time in America, households were pretty packed. 3 generations lived in a household. Often the grandparents, the mom and dad, and the children. So, and then sometimes, live-ins who helped in a business or an enterprise or a ranch lived in or near the premises as well. So it's a little different than today. What also was different from today was very few people had cars. The Model T was just being designed, and it was only the wealthy who really could afford them. So people walked everywhere, and they took trains, and they also rode horses if they had a horse. So people were out and about all the time. And in cities, they were just packing the streets. Now I have a picture that I've got to pull up on my computer because I don't have it printed out, to show you a street scene in New York, or some big city. I thought it was New York. Let me see if I can find it. There it is. And I think this is a good example of what cities looked like at the time. People of all ages, kids, grown-ups, were out on the streets, and the only, transportation vehicles at the time would have been carriages, maybe horse-drawn, very few that were motorized. Another picture that I thought was kind of cute from 100 years ago, during the time of the Spanish flu. These are all healthy people, but here's some more folks on horses to show you, how people were playing at a beach scene, and those, of course, are their bathing suits. It's kind of fun. And now today we think, of Target and Walmart and big stores like H-E-B and Wegmans as our grocery shopping, but 100 years ago people didn't have the choice we have, and a lot of the food was fresh, but everyone packed in to get their groceries in little stores that were piled high. So this is a good image of a little store and what it might have looked like. Most people tried to make their own food, and certainly, if they were lucky enough to have some yard space, they grew a lot of their own. And here's a good picture. I like this one because it kind of shows a home, and this might have been similar to what my family's home looked like back in that day. All the different age groups, the grandparents, the parents, and the little kids. That's who lived in the home. One of the big differences back then, and I want my grandkids to be aware of this, is by the age of 14, most boys, were in the workplace. Most families couldn't afford to have kids schooled beyond that. You had to be pretty well off to have your kids go into any higher education. So children worked, and we're so blessed that we have moved beyond that time, and our kids don't have to be out in factories and earning wages to bring home. Now, many later teens and college kids do help their families nowadays, but it isn't the most common scenario for children to be in the workplace. and certainly not 14 and up. And some of these kids don't quite look 14. So this is, I pulled those together because I wanted my kids, my grandkids, to have a sense of what it was like. And 100 years, you know, we don't think it goes by fast, but it does. And we still have in our family Great Aunt Dorothy on my deceased husband Renee's side, and Aunt Dorothy is, gosh, she's 94 going on 95, so she's was born just after the Spanish flu. No telephones, no cell phones, very little refrigeration, so and no vaccines and no antibiotics. When I was young, my mom used to just praise the fact that we had antibiotics because that's how she lost her mom. And there was no way to help cure the pneumonia that had set into her lungs. And so that was the big sorrow of her life. But Grandma Nana Martin and Henry Martin raised my mom and her sister, Juanita. They grew up partly on a ranch, and she enjoyed that life. And the only thing she talks about that was not fun for her out there was the outhouse, because not many people had flush toilets. So this is just a little view of how actually blessed we are to have the technology and science we have today to get through this coronavirus compared to 100 years ago in America with the big worldwide pandemic of that time, the Spanish flu. Another tidbit on the Spanish flu that I just learned, which relates to how, you know, the political game often doesn't tell the full truth in the beginning about such worldwide issues and catastrophes. The Spanish flu was only named the Spanish flu because the politicians didn't want people to be worried about a flu that was taking hold in France and Germany virulently during the later stages of World War I. They knew about it, but they didn't want to tell. So when the Spanish king fell ill with a terrible flu virus and died, they named it the Spanish flu. And that was really an American fake news concept, so that Americans wouldn't worry. Kind of rang a bell. That's kind of similar to some of the ways that things are approached here today in the USA 100 years later. Another tidbit that's interesting about the Spanish flu, I don't know if you've read this, it's probably been out all over, but it was an H1N1 virus. And the second big H1N1 virus, flu virus that impacted us greatly, was in 2009, the swine flu. At that time, somehow our public health did find out it was coming, and we had a vaccine. Many people in my family got that, the swine flu. My son Nino got it. My daughter Pilar was sick with the flu. My granddaughter Taylor was sick with the flu. And I was with Taylor and her family when she was sick with it. And I had had a shot. My public health had given me a shot when I worked for social services, because they knew I was going over to England to help care for my grandkids during a time when my son was getting ready to deploy. And so I was with her, and during the time she was very sick, and I didn't get sick. Also, my Renee's sister in Spain, her husband got the swine flu. It was very contagious. And he had to be on a ventilator in a hospital for quite a while, and he survived. So thank God the swine flu passed, but it was also an H1N1. This new flu coronavirus is COVID-19, so it's something that we're going to have to keep watch for and how it mutates. But that's my little bit on the coronavirus, Spanish flu, and how those 100 years apart, but there's similarities and great differences. And we should know we're blessed by living in a time when we have more technology to fight it, and we're going to beat it. And thanks to all the healthcare workers out there who are in the front lines. Really appreciate that. Lots of love to everyone. You stay really safe and healthy. And all my kids and grandkids, love you.